Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here once again to moderate a panel, this time on Mexico. Last year we talked about Latin America. This time we're going to talk about Mexico. Quick introduction. Now more than ever, Mexico seems to be defined by two opposing narratives. Here, the Mexico of opportunity, the country of the Mexican moment, where investment keeps growing and competitive advantages are undeniable. On the other hand, the Mexico of corruption, a country held hostage by impunity. In a recent article, Moises Naim spoke about Mexico's dichotomy. Good Mexico and bad Mexico, said Naim, are fighting for the country's fate. And although it may sound like an oversimplification, Naim is correct. Mexico really is a land of renewed opportunity, but it's also a country where corruption, impunity, and in certain regions, violence still thrives. President Enrique Peña Nieto himself embodies this contradiction. He's at the same time the president who deftly managed to pass an impressive set of reforms, impressive with a capital I set of reforms, and the man who considers corruption to be endemic. During an interview we had, he told me corruption was cultural in Mexico. So there you go. On the record, by the way. And the president has recently incurred, as you probably know, in a shameless conflict of interest himself, very, very controversial figure. For Moises Naim, the question remains a simple one. Which Mexico will win in the end? Will it be the Mexico of opportunity, where sectors like the automotive industry are booming, or the land where the resignation of the president over corruption can become a trending topic on Twitter at a moment's notice? A stellar panel of experts joins me to try and figure this very complicated country out. Jana Remes, economist and partner, McKinsey Global Institute. Just very brief intros. Marcela Mereles, Managing Director, Emerging Markets Sovereign Research, TCW. Alberto Gómez Alcalá, Executive Director, Institutional Development, Economic Research and Communication, Grupo Financiero Banamex City Group, and Executive President of the Mexican Banking Association, and Enrique Perret, Regional Director for North America, Pro Mexico. So let me jump right in. Jana, what do you make of Mexico's dual nature? Are you optimistic when it comes to the country's future? And what gives you pause?
I am optimistic, but I'm optimistic by nature. I think the odds in many ways, when you look at where people are employed, 1 out of 5 of the workers work in the highly productive, large, modern Mexico where productivity is growing at more than 6% a year. 4 out of 5 work in the rest of Mexico, most of them in the small businesses where actually productivity is declining, and we are seeing a missing of those growth companies. But I'm optimistic because, first of all, we do see increasing interest from everyone to spread the benefits more broadly. Supply chains are growing. Some of the reforms are really allowing the modern Mexico to have broader impact, while little by little, it will take longer time to start removing some of the barriers on the informality, on the regulatory constraints for growth, the lack of financing. Those are long-term challenges that I think most people are aware of. I worry about how long it will take, but I'm fundamentally optimistic.
And that takes us back to implementation. Marcela, Peña Nieto's reforms were universally celebrated, but there are numerous concerns, starting precisely with the challenges of implementation. What worries investors when it comes to Mexico? Do you agree that the implementation might be a lingering problem?
It might be, but I think that for the time being, investors are focused on the fact that the reforms were implemented. And, you know, in relative terms, I think this benefited Mexico tremendously, because the experience with the reforms agenda that was implemented over the last 18 months or so isn't really matched anywhere in the so-called emerging markets economies. So yeah, there are risks of implementation. I was talking to Enrique right before the panel. We needed to see the specific laws that will make these transformations operational. But so far we are very optimistic. In one of our conversations, I mentioned that, and this matches the experience of TCW, the company that I work for and that invests in Mexico. Over the last few years, Mexico received very large capital flows, in particular flows that fund government securities. For example, the share of foreign ownership of government securities went from 25% just 5 years ago to about 60% now. A cynical view would be to say, well, this is because there's so much global liquidity and there's a hunt for yield in the emerging markets, including Mexico. And it's partially true, but I think that Mexico captured so much of these inflows because it really stood out through the reforms agenda and through a very robust set of fiscal and monetary policies that really make Mexico a very investor-friendly destination.
I find this striking, Alberto, because once again we see this optimism from the outside, while if we were having this conversation in Mexico, everyone would be the exact opposite, completely pessimistic. So who's right?
Well, who knows? No, but well, being the only one living in Mexico in the panel, I agree with you. There is a contrasting view when you talk about Mexico, particularly in the business community in Mexico. And maybe this is so because in the day-by-day in Mexico, we're exposed to the local news, and some of them are not nice. But I fundamentally agree with Marcela and Jana in the sense that what the country is doing is quite remarkable. For example, the energy reform that is here, it's a very good reform. Nobody really expected such a deep, a profound, an integral reform as the one we already have. Second, the global economy is going to be more favorable for the country in the sense that the commodity cycle helped a lot the rest of Latin America and didn't help Mexico because Mexico was not really exposed to the oil boom as some other countries did. And the U.S. economy is going to do fine. And within the developed world, the U.S. economy has the best economic outlook. And this is a consensus. And through NAFTA, Mexico is going to be a beneficiary of that. And we have a lot of examples. You mentioned the automobile industry, but I'm sure Enrique can expand the comments there. But we have very many examples of a very deep integration, which is going to deliver some more dividends in the future. And third, we have macroeconomic stability. And that's an old asset that the country as a whole has been having. And the actual government is preventively responding to this lack of revenue that the public finance is going to have, explained by not only the reduction in the price of oil, but also the production of oil in Mexico, which has been one of the negative news in Mexico. And of course, what I think that concerns more the business community are two things. One is, of course, the fiscal reform, which was a component of the 11 reforms that President Peña Nieto implemented, which was not a very good reform, honestly. As a matter of fact, it was not even a step in the right direction in the sense that what the country needs is, of course, more tax revenue, but through value-added taxation rather than income taxation. And unfortunately, this reform didn't move towards that end. And of course, the business community is a bit upset about this. And the second element, you mentioned that very clearly, is this lack of institutional development, let me put it that way, in all related to transparency, accountability,
the rule of law,
impunity, the rule of law, exactly. All that part is also there, obviously. Some steps have been taken in the right direction, but maybe we need faster results in order to have a more benign view with the Mexican community, I could say.
So Alberto says you will make the case for Mexico. So go ahead.
Well, the name of the panel is Transformation of Mexico, right? So and to have or to measure a transformation, you need to take a base point and another year ahead. And we used to take the 94, 95 as a year of different changes, different things that happened that year. The NAFTA trade agreement was signed. the probably major crisis in Mexico took place in the banking system in Mexico, and different political issues that you probably remind, and a lot of things happened that year. But a lot of things, good things also happened after that crisis, after that agreement, right? For sure, a lot of the new institutions in Mexico, like the central bank, the Banking and Securities Commission, and different institutions were created in that period. And we are right now, we have different, very good institutions in my point of view. The trade agreement, the relation between Mexico and U.S., just to have an example, we passed to trade $50 billion between Mexico and U.S., and we are now trading more than 500 billion US dollars, right? So that's a lot of change in just 21 years ago. We are trading $1.4 million per minute between Mexico and U.S. We receive $160 billion just in the automotive industry in the past 15 years. So there is, for sure, there is a transformation in the, if you look what we were trading 20 years ago, oil and gas were for sure the most of that pie, right? Now high value manufacturers are 35–40% of that chart. So I think it's a good transformation. I think we as ProMexico, we have a very good pipeline in U.S. and Canada, working with the investors in doing the right thing in investing in Mexico. And I mean, investors look at the very specific details from rule of law to the image of the country, the indexes, a lot of things, right? And but the past year we received more than $25,000 billion in Mexico. So it's also a very good story, and we need to keep doing this way.
So Jana is, and again, I suggest that all of you can jump in if you feel like it. Okay. And of course, if you want if you have a question, please just raise your hand. So is corruption not an issue? When you look at Transparency International corruption index, Mexico is closer to Russia, much closer to Russia, and I shudder, than Norway, for example. Not thinking of two oil-centric nations. Yeah. But still, Enrique dismisses it a little bit and says, well, yeah, but we still receive a great amount of investment, and this is absolutely true. Mexico is being transformed by investment, and the figures are there. We shouldn't worry about this problem with the rule of law? Is it just...
Yeah, let me come back to that. But if you, given your license, jump at the questions, you said, what explains the difference between the view within Mexico and from outside? One thing we shouldn't forget is that most of the investments to Mexico that you read about, they are manufacturing investments for export. These folks are investing on a specific location in Mexico, which is a very large and very diverse country. For example, Quintana Roo has crime rates similar to Finland, which is my country of origin. And just like in the US...
And better weather.
by a long margin. So in many ways, if you're looking for one spot to produce something and export to the US, it's a very different proposition than trying to run a business across all of Mexico. So it is very, very different if you actually are exposed to all the different neighborhoods, if you are exposed to the risks on the fact that productivity and incomes don't rise. So I think you need to really have a sector-specific angle, and you need to think about where and how you are investing when you are thinking about the Mexico risk. And I think on the latter, that really does apply. To your question about corruption then, I don't think anybody would disagree that it matters a great deal. But I think it matters even more for the small producers. It's the small, in many ways, we see two Mexicos in the productivity side. We see the two Mexicos in the finance. We see the two Mexicos even in the legal side. A lot of things can be fixed just by a phone call for many large corporations, why for the small producers, getting the smallest process done can often be arduous process. And these are the kinds of things that really keep the long tail of low productivity producers alive. So when we talk about corruption, we should not forget the real cost it has to the 4/5 of the population who actually work on those small businesses. But going back to the big companies, finally to your question, companies tend to think of, the ones that we talk to, real investment makers, they think of corruption as or particularly any kind of risks in the country in different ways. There are, for example, if you think of the crime risk in the manufacturing supply chain, in some cases it is just a cost of doing business. You need to have an armored vehicle to accompany your shipments. And we estimated already 10 years ago from central Mexico to the border, it cost roughly 5% of the production cost. So in a way, it was kind of a cost of doing business. It's very different when the crime increases to a level where you don't want your managers to visit the location. And I think there, the first kind is something that companies are very used to managing across the globe. The latter one is the one that really becomes a barrier to investment. And given how much investment we are seeing in Mexico, as we have talked about, I think a lot of companies are finding a way to deal with it.
And just to expand on what Jana is mentioning, I acknowledge that I do sound very optimistic about Mexico, but at the same time, our investments are in the safest possible vehicles. So the bulk of our investments in Mexico are in government securities. We do invest in corporate bonds as well, but then issues of corruption, corporate governance really concern us, and any investment goes through a much more detailed vetting process. But the bulk of our investments so far has been in government securities and perhaps Pemex. We're confident that Mexico's credit worthiness is very strong. Mm-hmm. This is a view that has been reiterated by the rating agencies several times. Mexico has got really good about conveying to investors this credit worthiness of their investment profile. They got really good about policymaking, what is important for macroeconomic stability. Mm-hmm. There's a broad consensus across different political parties, which I also think that it's something that sets, that Mexico stands out. Across political parties, there is a consensus that fiscal discipline is important, that monetary policy should be independent, that low and stable inflation is something valuable. So all this is great. It's great for macroeconomic stability, and it's great for, it's one of the requirements for growth, but it's not the only one. So they need to go one step ahead and now work on growth, and they're not quite there yet.
You should let López Obrador know about this consensus. I think he didn't get the message.
That's true, but I'm talking about the critical mass that was necessary to make the reforms feasible.
I absolutely agree. The percentage in the Congress was astounding. I mean, America wants something like that one of these days, right? To pass a law with 70% of the legislative body. Alberto, you wanted to say something on
Yes. Let me talk a broad perspective about the modernization of a complex country as Mexico is. And you mentioned the relation of rule of law between Norway and Russia and some of those indicators relating to Mexico. Well, actually, if you see many of them, measures of institutional development in the country. And if you run them from the economic point, institutional and economic linked factors and rule of law and political factors, mm-hmm. in the economic ones, Mexico is very close to the best example in Latin America, for example. I'm talking about competitiveness, friendly to doing business in the country, indicators like those. And of course, NAFTA is a key element behind those. And if you move to the more rule of law linked on corruption or transparency linked, then we are close to the worst example in Latin America. So what this is telling us is that the advance to modernity, to put it somehow, is uneven. And Mexico is pretty much more advanced in the economic front than, let's say, in the political ones. Even though in the political ones, the country had achieved some changes, fundamental changes, like democracy and the like, and some other problems linked to this new phase of democratic processes in Mexico. So What I'm trying to say is that the country is modernizing itself, but it's an uneven modernization process, pretty much advanced in the economic front. And we have the numbers, as Enrique was saying. And just to complement what Hannah was saying about foreign investment, yes, we have a lot of manufacturing foreign investment, but also a lot of investment which is looking for the domestic and local forces in the financial sector, not only in securities or equities, but in the financial sector itself, banks, I'm talking about banks, and also real estate. A lot of foreign investment is going through tourism-related activities, real estate, and the like. So it's not exclusively explained by manufacturing process. It's a pretty well diversified front.
Since I know that the big elephant in the room is Pemex and the energy reform, I want you to talk about that, and maybe we could all add something to that part of the conversation. Talk about energy reform. Where is it heading in Mexico? There's also, again, with Pemex and with the new Pemex, the risk of corruption, but we've talked about that. Tell us, give us a perspective of where Pemex is heading.
Yeah. We need to start talking about the energy reform, right? That we just passed a year and a half from now. And the expectation was that it was huge, right? And Mariela, what we're talking about, no other country were doing this kind of reform in the energy sector. I mean, we had a lot of attention just in the Congress, right? Senate and the Congress. Now we have this challenge to do the right thing on the implementation. We, at least in U.S. and Canada, we grew our pipeline in projects from energy sector and talking about renewable energy, electricity, and oil and gas, probably 100%. A lot of interest, a lot of events around Mexico and energy. And in the renewable energy, you pretty much can do a lot of things right now. It's quite open, the solar panel energy and the wind energy, at least to produce, and it's another thing to sell it. But it's there is a structure right now that is working, and a lot of companies are doing different things, from the big ones to a small and medium size from Mexico or from other parts of the world. Electricity is also that I think it's moving on very, very quickly. We just had very big investments linked to different Mexican companies like Cemex and Peñoles, etc. So they are doing pretty good things. The oil and gas probably it's the difficult and the more complex sector, or subsector in the industry, and we are, as a lot of companies, are expecting that in the next couple of years, the secondary rules will be in the table, and they will be very good for everyone. Let me, and I don't know if that answered this big question, but let me return to one comment that Alberto said about this difference between the rule of law in the economic side and the probably security or political side, and we have that same difference between geographic or the state at the state level, right? We have 32 different entities. Hannah just mentioned about, investment going to Querétaro, which right now very good state to invest in the aerospace industry, automotive industry, and IT. And but you can also have Sinaloa with a huge facility of different agribusiness companies. And then you have Quintana Roo for the tourism, and then you have, I don't know, El Bajío with Guanajuato receiving a lot of investment from the automotive industry from Asia, right? But you do have the southeast of Mexico, who is probably not
Underdeveloped, no?
it's underdeveloped, right? And we do need public policies there in order to boost the competitiveness and from the infrastructure to political and rule of law issues. But I think, again, and I'm very optimistic about that, we are in the right
track.
order. Yeah.
Jana?
I just wanted to violently agree that while we focus on the oil industry investments, which potentially could be a clear near-term fuel to the macroeconomy, if you had a real shot in the arm, if there was a lot of investments, we shouldn't forget about electricity. I'll translate that to why it matters for both the foreign investments as well as the small business owners. Power today in Mexico for industrial and commercial folks costs 75% more than in the US, which is a big competitiveness constraint. And I think if that reform can help reduce that, that's a big factor. It also means that it's 75% more expensive for a small informal player to become formal and actually start playing instead of the subsidized residential rates, the higher ones. And all of these are little steps towards making it easier for both the large companies to expand as well as the smaller ones to reduce the cost it is for them to become formal and actually start building a platform for longer-term growth.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, this issue of the dual economy in Mexico is something that it does concern us, and it does. You know, Mexico stands out from the rest of Latin America. There's absolutely no doubt about it. When I think about Mexico, though, I think about clean slates and clean balance sheets. The rest of Latin America now is basically going through a process of unwinding some of the excesses that were created during the commodity boom, the credit boom that took place in places like Brazil and Peru, increases in real wages much above and beyond productivity gains. None of this happened in Mexico. And we need to look into why that is the case and how that can change. But at the same time, there's no excesses to unwind. So I think that with these reforms, with the fiscal reform, which I agree with you, it was not a reform, it was a tax increase exercise. Hopefully, these resources will be put to good use in order to boost productivity, to narrow the gaps that Jana is mentioning, and with that, create the basis for real wages in Mexico to finally start growing, not only in the already fairly high productivity sector, but in the low productivity sectors as well.
Now, Alberto, let me. I know that you want to jump in as well, but let me add something to the conversation.
Sure.
I've read experts, people we both respect, criticize the Peña Nieto government for losing its economic focus. They say instead of consolidating its presence in the great North American market, it's looking elsewhere. Is this fair criticism?
I don't think so. I mean, geography is destiny, they say. And if you see the size of our northern neighbor, the States, and the size of the rest of Latin America, I mean, it's unfair to really say that Mexico can realistically be pretty much diversified in terms of trade or foreign direct investment or any indicator you would like to make. The rest of Latin America is equivalent to the GDP of California.
And the Pacific?
Well, the Pacific is fine, but again, if you concentrate on the North, I mean, it's much more than a huge market to really concentrate upon. Then whatever you do in the rest of the world is going to look relatively little. That's point number one. Point number two, the States remains as the major market in the world, particularly where Mexico can really and deeply integrate in the manufacturing process and in the chain of value of even high-tech sectors. So the advantage for a country like Mexico is very clear there. And also, if you talk even to energy, the energy sector, I mean, the the most sensitive strategical decision is to really integrate the energy market in North America. And obviously, it has a lot of political complications in Mexico, but the most difficult part of the question is already solved with the energy reform. So those are very good ideas, economically sensible, and those will increase the concentration of Mexico with the U.S. economy. And I don't think that's bad. Quite to the contrary, it's a very wise decision trying to exploit the geography we have. And I wanted to jump in the previous arguments, saying that the average number is not really representative of Mexico. Basically, in general, we can talk about productivity, we can talk about regional development, we can talk even about GDP growth. For example, Enrique mentioned the Bajío region, where the country is receiving a lot of the foreign direct investment associated to the auto industry. Well, that part of the country is not small. I mean, it's more or less the size of Hungary. And the growth in the last 5-6 years of that region, of that part of Mexico, was 6.5% per year, which was closer to Chile or to Peru, which are the best examples in Latin America. And that's a significant number. Aguascalientes, which is an state in that region, last year grew 12%. Those are Chinese numbers. And of course, we have some other examples like Campeche in the Gulf of Mexico, which has been declining for 15 years. And that's basically explained by the decline in oil production. So whenever you visit Mexico and you say that the country is growing 3% or whatever, they don't believe you. Either they are hoping to grow that much, or they simply are pretty much higher in their states. So talking about average could be misleading basically in any economic indicator in the country.
Yes, a couple of questions from the audience. Sir, behind you, yes? Next, you'll be next, sir. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
If you could identify yourself.
David Fong from Vancouver. We provide professional support services to manufacturing, to energy, to electricity. We are in Mexico already, but we are wondering whether we should jump with our 2 feet into Mexico. So that's why I'm here. We look at Mexico's economic growth, seem to have some parallel to China. Okay. Chinese economic growth took off without any democratic government, okay? Despite the lack of transparency, despite the lack of rule of law. I would like to hear from a panel, what's your view whether that kind of disengagement or apparent disengagement between economic factor and political factor is sustainable? Or if, in fact, that we see what's happening in China, the continued tension, and you wonder if, in fact, China could stay together when you have wealth being generated, expectations of the public going up, and yet the political system is not moving along. So that's one element. I think the other element that I would like to hear from the panel is that when we go into Mexico, we would be looking for a lot of high-skilled workers. And I'm hearing that Mexico is meeting the needs of the manufacturing sector. But manufacturing sector is mostly assembly workers. Okay? And I do not always consider assembly workers being high-skilled workers. We are service providers. We need people who can think, who can solve problems. So I just would like to hear from the panel.
2 very interesting questions.
Well, yes, it's a very complex question. Let me split in 2 parts. One could be what in Mexico we refer to the Italian model, meaning that Italian can be very strong in economic terms, particularly in the north, not necessarily in the south, and not necessarily very competitive in the political arena because there is always a mess. If that model can be translated to Mexico, I don't think so. What I think, and I'm also an optimistic here, is that we're moving unevenly, even in the political arena. Transparency is there in Mexico. but also impunity. So, and the government, the actual government is sensitive to that as well. For example, the government just moved to one of them a constitutional reform and the other one just a secondary reform to strengthen all anti-corruption elements in the public services and to be more transparent and to incorporate more corporate governance in the day-by-day operation of the government. If that is enough or not, we can argue about that, but the country is moving. Maybe the business community wants the movement to be faster, but I think that the country is moving. And the political power is so diversified that we can construct check and balances relatively easily, preventing that the whole political class really wants to follow the right incentives, which I believe essentially are there. So I think Mexico will move slowly, but will move in the right direction. And talking about high-skill jobs, again, it's very complex, and we can split regionally the answer as well. We have some regions in the Guadalajara region, which is in the west of the country, where the second largest city is, which is called Guadalajara. And they have been specialized in all the computer-related chain of value industry. And one of the elements that helps Guadalajara to become that is precisely the universities they have there. And also the Querétaro example, as Enrique was saying, even the aeronautics industry is creating universities and creating programs to train people because they clearly see that they need students, engineering, the people you were describing, because otherwise they are going to face a bottleneck there. And so you have a lot of examples there. Maybe, again, we need to move faster, but you find a lot of examples that answers your concerns. And I could be optimistic about that. And definitely you have to jump with your 2 feet in Mexico.
No.
Sir.
Can I jump in Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't see. Sorry. Go ahead, sure.
A very quick response of the talent. I think there is one talent pool of Mexicans that we haven't fully tapped on, and that's the expat Mexicans. And this is an opportunity that played a huge role in India's growth, in Israel's growth, everywhere else. And Mexico today is attracting more immigrants from Europe and from North America than anywhere else. There is a huge pool of very talented, well-trained and apprenticeship Mexican Americans and Mexican Europeans elsewhere. And I hope some of them will go back and find good jobs and be part of the transformation of Mexico.
My name is Gary Davis from Greenwich, Connecticut. So I appreciate the comments about the GDP disparity by region. Yet at the same time, Mexico is kind of like the emerging markets basket case when it comes to GDP growth on a relative basis. And so I'm interested in how an equity investor would participate in Mexico, not being able to do direct foreign investment, but rather public investment, to be able to benefit, let's say, from this GDP disparity and get the stars without the dogs and the pigs, so to speak.
Well, and I'm sure Marcela will jump in as well, but excellent question. And if you see the economic data in Mexico, one of the sectors where, given the complexity of the country, which lags behind is, for example, financial deepening in general. If you see, for example, the stock market valuation in terms of GDP, it's very low, even in relation to Latin America. Second, part of the explanation is that you don't have big companies that are very common in other markets. You don't have a Petrobras equivalent. You don't have any public sector monopolies or public sector utilities in the market, as, for example, Colombia or even Brazil have. Third, one of the success in Mexico is the auto industry, the manufacturing industry, the export-linked sectors, and you don't have direct representative of that economic engine in the stock market, for example. You can have some auto parts companies, some here and there, but you don't really have a lot of those examples in your market. So it's very clear in Mexico that you need to develop, or we need to develop, additional asset classes. And we're starting to develop some of them linked to real estate, linked to what we call fibras, which is, how do you say that in English?
Fiber.
Fiber rates and all those new classes. But it's still an evolving element there. And to add an additional complexity here, the pension funds are restricted in their investment regulation, and they have been invested relatively heavily in a relatively narrow stock market. So valuation in Mexico could be a bit expensive nowadays. So we need to solve a lot of these issues, create new asset classes, diversify the investment regime of the pension companies, take advantage of the implementation of the energy reform to invite more private equity funds, equity companies, and the like. And again, sounds a lot of homework to do, but I'm optimistic that we can handle that.
I think I disagree with your label a little bit. I don't think Mexico is a basket case for growth, because by basket, at least I associate with a lot of volatility. It's either great or it's awful. It hasn't been great.
More on the rate of growth.
Yeah, it hasn't been great, but it has been okay. But it hasn't been great.
It's been like 0.6% for 20 years.
Yeah, they managed to, as I mentioned, with the fiscal and monetary combo that they have now in place for more than a decade, they managed to make it stable, but not great. And if we look at the really powerful equity stories in Latin America over the last decade, the story was really of that rising tide that was lifting all boats and moving millions of people into the middle class, right? This is what I think still needs to happen in Mexico, because this is where comes the story. I remember going to my home country a few years ago. Would be Brazil. And just talking to people and family members, and I realized, wow, you know, it's not that this new middle class, it's not a car that they want. They want an ultrasound. They want better health services for themselves. So from there, you get a lot of themes and powerful, you know, multipliers into the equity class and valuations that I think it still didn't happen in Mexico. And hopefully with the reforms, with the productivity, sustaining real wage growth, we'll finally see that move of people into the middle class. This is what I'm hoping for.
Another question? Yes, sir.
There does seem to be a strong growth in middle class, almost maybe better than most countries around the world, where you have this new middle class. What will the implications be politically in Mexico? And a side question, will Mexico get to the point where they get off the crutch of a depreciating currency? Will Mexico feel confident enough to maybe having a stable currency, or even someday maybe an appreciating currency?
To whom?
I don't think it's a crutch. I think that currencies, and this is a characteristic of Mexico and of other emerging markets, it's a good thing that currencies are finally fluctuating. We are going through a phase of strengthening U.S. dollar, not only with respect to emerging market currencies, but G10 developed market currencies. I think that what Central Bank of Mexico is doing is simply to let the markets determine the price of the peso. I don't think there is a competitive devaluation going on here.
Yeah, I completely agree with Marcela, and actually the peso market is very liquid. It functions 24/7, and the whole year. We have a central bank which is very market friendly. It's a central bank which doesn't like to surprise markets. And sometimes in some volatile episodes, what we see is that the peso overreacts, because some funds use the peso as a hedge currency to some other parts of the region, or even to Latin America, or even to emerging market countries. So you have a transitory deviations not explained by fundamentals. And if you review fundamentals related to the peso level, what I personally believe is that the peso is very weak. I mean, the fundamentals are very solid, are there. And as soon as the volatility and the uncertainty around the normalization process of the Fed and the like dissipates, I would argue that the peso will strengthen. And the third element there is that it's not only currency movements, but if you see labor cost in dollar terms in Mexico, it's a unique example in the global economy. It basically has remained very flat. So competitiveness is even increased by that currency depreciation, which is really in no need to do it, because the labor market is already in a very, very competitive position.
Jana, you wanted to?
A very quick comment. I'm an economist, as a confession, which means that I look at the fundamentals very much as my colleague panelists did. And we know that given Mexico's income, as soon as productivity and income start to grow, we would expect the exchange rate to appreciate, wages to start growing, etc. So in many ways, there is no institutional reasons that won't happen. It really is the same challenge of growth. And in the short term, oil price is one that's going to influence this a lot as well. So in many ways, you can explain the peso changes pretty well with the fundamentals. And on the middle class, it really is, again, the same story. Productivity has grown even in the largest companies, but their cost has remained the same. Until we start seeing those incomes to rise, we don't really see the benefits of growing domestic demand from the rising middle class. In many ways, Mexico's challenge is no longer the bottom of the pyramid. It's basically the belly of the market, and how we can sustain the growth and momentum higher up in the income pyramid.
Now, politics featured in 2 of the 3 questions, so I'm going to bring it back into the conversation. Enrique, let's talk about Mexico's image abroad. I looked at your Twitter feed yesterday, and I saw that you're a fan of Alejandro González Iñárritu. So am I, but I can tell you that he's not a fan of the government, as we could see at the Oscars. Neither are many of Iñárritu's colleagues and other very prominent Mexicans abroad, even the Chicharito, who likes everyone. He likes everyone, he doesn't like the government. Are they wrong? What should we make of Mexico's current government?
Well, one thing is the government, and other thing is Mexico as a country, right? I mean, for sure, Alejandro González Iñárritu and Chicharito loves Mexico, and they talk about Mexico in a good way, and that's good. I mean, and they talk good about the population, and the average of population in Mexico is 27 years old. That is also a very good for the thing of the high educated and high skilled
Workforce,
people, right? Workforce. I mean, in the past, Leon, I mean, every administration, I have 34 years old, and I do remember every administration with a bad story and a good story, right? A bad image about the government for different reasons, different factors, but I think the people behind the country, the people behind, and also the government, a lot of people working very, very hard in the government, not just in the companies, because we also have a story about business people, right? Bad stories about business, good stories about business. You have, I mean, in the entire society, you have, I don't believe in a good Mexico and a bad Mexico. I do believe in millions of realities in our country, and different, I mean, it's a very diverse and a very big country, right?
But corruption is not cultural, right?
It's not. I mean, for me.
Come on, be brave. Disagree with your president.
No. For me, it's not cultural. For me, it's. I mean, we can see corruption everywhere. We can see corruption in the government, but also in the industries and also in the streets. Corruption for me is something. It's a word to fight. We need to fight against corruption. And yesterday I was reading something like it was says something. It's a biblical things. It's the people free of guilty throw the first stone, right? It's something related with the Bible. And the thing is that we don't have too much people free of guilty, right? To throw stones in our country, and probably in too many countries. So people stand up and say things, and we look for Alejandro González Iñárritu and the Oscar, and we look for Chicharito playing in. But we need more people in our country. We need more people saying good things about what is happening in Mexico. Right?
I will
that's
very quickly on what is cultural in Mexico. It has the best political jokes ever. I have been following since the time of Carlos Salinas, and I must say, I hope that will never go away.
It won't. Believe me. Alberto, you wanted to say something?
Well, I basically...
I would like for you to tell us what should we make of this government. Should we worry? It has 3 years left.
Well, actually, if you see the surveys that we have in the country, for example, seems to me that what Mexicans are a bit disappointed about is the political class in general.
Even more worrisome, that is.
Well, yes.
I mean, when politics, you started looking at Venezuela kind of...
I think that's
model.
part of the problem and part of the solution, because it's very clear. A reputation of a politician in Mexico everywhere is unfortunately very bad. So the society can impose a transformation. Actually, I would say that the recent changes we have seen in the government were kind of imposed by social media and social reaction, and the government was sensitive of this frustration or angriness that it was very, very evident associated to conflict of interest or corruption scandals or whatever. So, of course, there is a risk, and you mentioned the name of López Obrador, who is there. But we can also make the argument that every political party is not in the peak of popularity, that they will need to react to really respond to the society, because the society is very clearly saying that it's disappointed with what they been doing in terms of this agenda of transparency, corruption, conflict of interest, and rule of law in general.
The rise of a future populist alternative headed by Mr. López Obrador, who has lost twice in the election. He hasn't recognized any defeats as legal, but that's just him. He has his own numbers, he says. That doesn't worry you at all?
Well, it's a scenario we cannot rule out, definitely. It's a risk. I would say it's not significant risk, but it's there, yes, definitely. And that's why the modernization agenda needs to deliver. It needs to deliver in the economic front, and it needs to deliver in the political front, definitely. Yeah, we need that.
Another question from...
Probably, I mean, we can also talk about education, because at the end, the transformation is all about the people, right? I mean, there is no transformation without the people, the middle class, the kids and the school, and I think that's a very good reform that we also achieved in the past years. I mean, we need the big transformation in Mexico will be when a kid in Quintana Roo and a kid in Tijuana have the same opportunity, right? To have this leapfrog and to reach the higher education that they probably want, and that's the real transformation. And I didn't see this topic. I mean, education as a whole in this panel. I don't know if we can talk a little bit about that, because at the end, corruption and the same transformation, institution and governments. I mean, it's people, right? It's people who made the corruption. It's people who.
I'm sure if you're going to talk about education, I'm sure you're concerned about it, right? I mean,
I
Mexico
do.
lags behind.
For sure. But I'm also very optimistic about that topic, and I think we have a very good people talking against the status quo in the education, and I think they have been doing things very good in the education. I think we are all aware about the system now, and we are all aware what we need to do in the educational system in Mexico.
My name is Natalie Hoffman, and my company is Brazil Business. Marcela, what do you think about the same?
You don't need it, but it's okay.
Okay. Well, my own suggestion, and I'd like to ask Marcela if she thinks it's plausible for Mexico, is for the Mexicans to do something like what's going on in Brazil right now with the...
Hopefully not.
Well, yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully not politically, but by lawyers, not waiting for education, but by lawyers, prosecutors in a city called Curitiba that's not in the power centers of São Paulo and Rio and Brasilia, who have brought about this, let's hope, for end to impunity for Petrobras in the pay-to-play scandal. I think something very important is happening there. And these are lawyers who were educated in the United States and watched Law and Order and have gone back there and have brought plea bargains, and they're putting big people in jail from the richest families, and change is going on. I don't think you can wait for education so much.
You know, I think so. I obviously followed very closely what has been happening in Brazil. And I have to say, as a Brazilian, the scope and the dimension and what they accomplished, the lawyers, as you mentioned, surprised me on the upside. And I started asking myself if we could see something like this in Mexico. I don't have an answer yet. And I don't think that necessarily the timing is here and is right now. But what I do think the two countries have in common is precisely this development process. And with development process and with a growing middle class, perhaps at a slower pace in Mexico, but a gradual process in that direction, comes a voice, comes this discontentment with corruption. And I think this is what in Brazil allowed this scandal and the consequences to be transformational. And I think this will happen in Mexico as well. Here I am downplaying López Obrador again. But I don't think that the dissatisfaction with corruption in Mexico will lead 3 years down the road necessarily to poor choices in who to vote for president. I see this electorate voting for those that, yes, can address the corruption issue and deliver on developments, on rising real wages, etc. I don't think it will lead to a step back on what has been accomplished already.
It will be 5 steps back, I think. I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I go back to what Alberto was saying. I mean, the country is moving when it comes to corruption. I don't think the government had any intention to tackle corruption before all this enormous series of scandals hit the government very recently. But the fact is, the opposition pushed for the reform that led to the anti-corruption law, and the government delivered, and that's saying something, right?
Yeah, of course, yes. That's a reason why to be optimistic. I share the optimism of the panel. Yeah, yeah, that is happening, and we can argue about the reform and this, how many steps did we advance and everything, but things are moving in the right direction in general, taking advantage of some of these problems. And of course, a lot of problems remains. Insecurity remains as a big issue, of course. But things are happening also in the right sense.
So I guess the good Mexico is winning. Is it?
Yes.
I think it is. Fantastic.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So go invest in Mexico, please. And I thank you all so very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.